wanted to say a quick welcome to everybody here. I'm Taylor Owen. I'm the professor at McGill and the director of the Center for Media, Technology and Democracy. And one of our goals with the center is to try our best to bring together these too often siloed conversations around journalism policy and media policy and technology policy. And one of the issues that's central to this kind of intersection of those issues is media capture, is the way in which our new digital infrastructure and the players and actors within it is changing how journalism is funded and what it is. And I think this book that we're going to talk about today really captures that really elegantly and thoughtfully. So we're excited to talk about it and hear from some of the people who have produced it. It's also, this event is also sort of part of a series that Anya and I have been doing on journalism policy itself, from competition policy to state intervention in the journalism market. And we'll post some links to some of those other events. They're the other events that we've done in the past, if you want to check those out. So with that, I will pass it on to Anya, who's going to moderate and host this conversation for the next hour.
Taylor, thank you. And thank you to all the participants. I'm to all the people in the audience as well. This is the first event launching our new book, Media Capture, How Money, Digital Platforms, and Governments Control the News. So it's very exciting to do a book launch event, even if it's on Zoom. And it's also the first time that we're all in a room together since forever. So very happy that everyone's here. And I'll just give a little bit of context before I introduce the panelists. Media capture is an economics term, which is really about soft pressure and how business cronies and governments often end up in cahoots controlling the news. So journalists sort of know this. Maybe a soft censorship would be another way of describing it. But the sort of problem, the phenomenon of media capture is something that a few economists started getting very interested in about 15 years ago. And in 2016, I thought, well, this is a very interesting subject, and it would be great to get journalists and communications people to start thinking about it. So we held a conference at Columbia University. And there were some people like Emily Bell, Dean Starkman, Mark Nelson, who got it immediately. Mark and the Center for International Media Assistance had actually already been working on media capture for several years because it really summed up the situation that they saw in countries that they had been working in and countries they were familiar with, like Eastern Europe and Hungary. Emily Bell, of course, director of the Tao Center, had been working for years on this whole problem of platforms and publishers, as had Taylor. So they understood. And Dean Starkman, of course, had written one of the definitive books on business journalism when you were back in New York before you joined the ICIJ. So we all got together to talk about media capture. And we ended up, this is actually the third volume. So we did a sort of academic volume with scholarly works. And I think maybe the first one was the one that CIMA published, again, Center of International Media Assistance, which was on capture around the world. It was actually the first time that anyone had looked at capture around the world. And then I thought, building on Emily's work, it was really time to start thinking about the digital platforms and the way that they were starting to have more and more control over the media. So this was when Nikki Usher, a professor in Chicago, sorry, let me put on my glasses and read your proper title there, associate professor at University of Illinois College of Media, agreed to step in and contribute a chapter. And the book, of course, got delayed thanks to the pandemic, but I'm sorry to say that the subject is more relevant now than it was when we started this volume 5 years ago. Media capture is now a subject we hear about all the time at conferences. It's spread even more. It used to be this obscure thing. We used to think, well, Hungary, Turkey. Now it's all over Central Europe. Got worse, obviously, after 2008. And I think the role of the big tech giants has also become top and, front of mind for so many people. So I won't drag on too long because we've got contributors here to talk about their chapters, except to say media capture is a growing problem. We've been assembling a body of work over several years about how to understand it in different parts of the world. And one of the great things about this book is that it actually has solutions. So I think what we'll do is we'll start with Emily Bell, director of the Tao Center for Digital Journalism, who's really done more than anyone to kind of define this problem of digital capture. Then we'll go over to Nikki Usher, and then Dean and Mark can talk about some of the solutions and some of the policy work also that SEMA has been doing. So that's good. And I guess I'm not reading out your titles because they're on the poster and we don't have that much time because I know we're ending sharply at 1 o'clock New York time. So thanks everyone. A Zoom book launch. Let's all do a big cocktail party one day, but this is a great start. Thanks to all of you for coming. Emily, take it away.
Thanks. Sorry, I'm just making sure that I'm not muted, coming off the back of late night teaching last night. Thanks very much indeed, Anya. So I guess that I'll just talk very briefly about our perspective on this as a research centre and a little bit about my perspective from having written a chapter in the book, which is, I think, since really when I was working as a journalist, my background is a technology, business and media journalist, mostly at The Guardian and then editing The Guardian's websites for 10 years between 2000 and 2010. And one of the really preoccupying themes throughout that time was this thing called convergence. And I think that we saw it as two distinct but related fields moving slowly together in what we imagined would be a kind of reordering, if you like, of how journalism was done, who owned the media, etc. I think what was underestimated throughout those years, sort of the early 2000s, was really the way that convergence would play out in the last 5 to 10 years, which is instead of this slow moving together, you had a sudden overwhelming of the entire field. And I think that we're still not, we still haven't quite internalized how much of a change has taken place. So it's interesting to me, for instance, that as a body of professional communication scholars and press critics, we will fetishize and think about the headlines on New York Times pieces and which media outlet is doing what, and that's also very, very, very important. But it's really only a very tiny part of the picture. And meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, you have congressional hearings which are pulling the heads of platforms, Google and Facebook and Twitter, in front of their hearings to ask about bias in their distribution algorithms and whether or not there's a conservative or anti-conservative bias, whether or not they're moderating their platforms properly. Because those are the things that actually I think people are now really concerned about. And that's a sign, if you like, that there has been an ebbing away of power from what was one set of gatekeepers and into another. For journalism, there's a very specific problem, which has been, I think, written about and described really brilliantly by all the people actually on this panel at various points, which is that it's very difficult to conceive of a field of journalism which is, if you like, supported by very large scale companies whose principal aims and interests are not those of journalism or not necessarily even those of the free press. And we're seeing, I think, now the kind of realization of some of those tensions playing out in global policy discussions. So it's, again, really fascinating to see in the last 6 months the electrifying effect that the Australian News Media Bargaining Code, whatever beefs one has about its roots and what motivations there were for that law. It's the first time you've had a country say, we actually want to have some control over what is happening to the fabric of our journalism industry, which has been decimated at a local level because the advertising model has simply disappeared. It has, in digital formats, almost entirely gone to Google and Facebook. We want to be able to have a system where if these extractive companies, which are not native to Australia, but come from the west coast of America, we want to have some ability to force them into negotiation if they won't arbitrate. And I think that that has sparked a global conversation. I know that Anya and Taylor have done a great job of hosting some of that in this series, where countries are saying, how do we get a stake in this as well? And what is the answer? And it's an interesting moment for journalism, because as the big platforms increase their funding, and as the advertising market does not rebound, and not only does the advertising market not rebound, but the traffic to news outlets has precipitatively fallen this year, as we get over this kind of momentous news year of Trump and the pandemic. We're going to see, I think, more failure in the market. And the answer to that at the moment doesn't exist really in policy form. So into that vacuum, into that policy vacuum, you have increased spending moving from Facebook and Google in all sorts of initiatives, partly because they are worried about the pressure of regulation. So I think the sort of, if you like, the things that I described in the chapter which relate to this, and how everything in the newsroom is remodeled around the existence of search, the existence of social, I think that we're just beginning to understand that there is a problem here, and the problem is about to really amplify itself in the market. So I think that we're at a fascinating moment. This is a great discussion to be having right now, and it's a different type. We're used to media capture. I think this is a slightly different kind of capture, because it really is an overwhelming of the field by companies that don't at heart share those values. And the question is, are they going to internalize those values and support a free press, or are they going to align, if you like, with anti-democratic forces and sometimes pro-market forces, which actually have the effect of suppressing the free press? I don't know if that's enough, Anya, but that's an outline of the problem as I see it.
Yeah, and I think also, as you mentioned, the tech giants, I mean, I wish we had time to talk about this more in the book, were the people that sort of, quote unquote, came to the rescue of journalism during the pandemic, right? And so Facebook and Google started all these funds, started all these deals. Yeah. And we don't know, at one of our last events, Taylor talked about, we haven't seen those contracts. We don't know to what extent there's gag clauses, to what extent media outlets that are taking money from Google and Facebook, how worried should we actually be about that? But I think you've also hit on something that we even knew at the 2016 conference, which was when there are financial downturns, that affects journalism and who survives and who ends up getting, right? Rasmus Kleist-Nielsen and I have talked about this, that when journalism outlets start to get desperate for funding, that can lead to the conditions of capture. And I feel, Nikki, this is something that you've really tackled in your new book, News for the Rich, White and Blue. So I'm sure you'd like to, I mean, if we could get a little taster of your book and perhaps how that relates to this book, we'd love to hear about that, Nikki. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So I think what Emily and I think everybody on this panel is, so thanks for having me, but we're all sort of kindred spirits in the sense that we are willing to be open and critical of platforms, and we are willing to be independent from them and resist taking their money or any of the things that they dangle at us, which in many ways could help our research, right? And I think that independence is getting rarer and rarer in terms of the academy, and it's something just, I think, to recognize as a point of sort of academic capture of critique, right? But the book I wrote, I mean, so I was kind of not sure whether to talk about what I was pushing for and what we were talking about in this book. So I guess I am happy to plug my own book, but I sort of feel like what I really worry about, and it does connect very much so, is that the economic pressures on the news industry are forcing news organizations to respond in a way that really undermines their commitment to reaching to equality and justice and democracy. And to survive, news organizations are pursuing deliberate strategies that leave people out. And I think that the sad thing about this is being done very consciously. So to survive, news organizations from the New York Times to the Dallas Morning News to even good old National Public Radio, NPR, right? The choices that are being made about how to pursue revenue streams and the content that will be included really leaves out tremendous swaths of people. And it's really not just about paywalls, it's about outlook. And it's about who gets to be in newsrooms creating content at the outset. So how does this all connect back up to questions around technology, right? And I think that what we can see is the absolute and utter collapse of the digital advertising model for news organizations has put them in this point of pressure. And so I'm not really sure what the solution is, but I do know that the US really needs to move towards privacy regulations, towards actually financial aid reform to improve equity in newsrooms, and maybe start to embrace partisan media, because partisan media sells. And I've been really wrestling with how to embrace, like, can we push forward a partisan media system that is also accountable and, looks more like European countries than, our current sort of hyper-partisan right-wing media system. So I sort of feel like that was a little rambly, but the point of what I'm talking about here is that the market failure of journalism has created geographic and social polarization within news organizations, right? That compounds the existing already problems of, geographic polarization, political polarization, and cultural distance and social inequality that exists outside journalism. And yeah, so that's.
Well, I was going to say, I think you're raising a new. I mean, this is about caring about capture, as you always realize there's so many things to be worried about. So we used to think, well, ownership or advertising were forms of capture, but now you're saying the sort of economic desperation and the going after certain kinds of readers can make the problem worse in this situation. In fact, one of the fans of yours that I was talking to last week is doing his PhD on this subject and was saying how vital your work has actually been for him. So thanks, Nikki, for raising a whole other aspect. We haven't even gotten to your chapter, but maybe we'll have time for that afterwards. So I think Dean and then Mark, so that we've set the stage with some of the things to worry about, and I'm very excited now to hear some of the solutions, including Dean, your unlikely solution from Hungary, which we don't think is a solution.
A little twist for the panel. Yeah, my chapter comes in two parts. I'll give you two for the price of one. The first part is a picture of despair. I'm basically trying to convince the world, and mostly myself probably, that commercial models to support large fact-gathering platforms have essentially failed. And I think I'm trying to convince the world that we need to give up the ghost on digital ad-supported journalism. This first part of the chapter is basically a history of commercial journalism failures, starting with good intention but failed efforts at the San Jose Mercury, and all the way through all the failures of local news to weather the digital storm, the failures of venture capital supported outlets from the 2010s, 11s, Mike, Mashable, GigaOM, Fusion, and even in problems, even with ones that survive, like BuzzFeed and that type of thing. What I'm trying to do, and I'm coming at from this is a place of sadness, because I grew up in an era of commercially supported, financially autonomous, very strong local newsrooms around the country. And I understand there were problems, and I get all of the, and not all of the critiques, but I've tried to internalize a lot of those critiques of that model. But there are worse ways to support a news organization And I'm talking about large scale news organizations with dozens or hundreds of reporters, which I think is what we're all looking for. It's there are worse ways to support this than tens of thousands of readers and several thousands of local advertisers. Again, not the perfect model, but I'm telling you, there isn't one. I work for ICIJ. We're philanthropically supported. I don't think that's a model. I think that's just asking for money. So I'm big into models. So anyway, read the chapter and argue with me about the hopelessness of commercial models. But I would say Exhibit A is the closing today or this week of the Alden Global Capital's purchase of the Tribune Company, with the company's own debt on its books, and just another anyway, don't get me started. So that's that part. So what do we do? So I live in Hungary. I'm in Budapest right now, and I am privileged to know amazing journalists here, redoubtable, courageous, and I would say highly professional. It's absolutely first rate. I know this because they publish a lot in English, and I know them, and they're trained in the U.S. and two of them are kind of keeping the flame of independent media alive. And the reason we know about the corruption of the Orban family and the Orban entourage is because of them. Period. Full stop. And it's amplified by European commissions that basically steal their work, and it's amplified by the local German-owned, Bertelsmann-owned TV station. But basically, they're sort of keeping hope. So how do they do that? Well, they have a subscription-based model. But one thing that they've actually relied on is something called the 1% law, which was passed during the liberal go-go 90s, a time of great hope here, of great reform, great innovation. A lot of people look back with great nostalgia for that period, with good reason, and wonder, how it went all wrong. But we don't have time for that. But in this period, 1997 to be specific, they passed a very liberal Media Reform Act, but also a change to the tax code that allowed Hungarians to was not even contemplated for media at all. It was basically designed to support local charities, literally animal shelters and orphanages and garden societies, you name it. But you're among them were news organizations could actually become an eligible organization, and they kind of stumbled their way into it. This is the two outlets here, Direct 36 and Atlazo, which means transparent, and it's now become a pillar of their funding. And what's beautiful about this, it's essentially a tax credit. I'm not inventing anything. This is something Victor Pickard and John Nichols and Robert McChesney and have been stumping for in the U.S. But we go into it. Ryan Chittum and I go into it in some detail, both the history of the Hungarian law, the amount it would raise, which would be more than enough to cover to rebuild the American local news landscape. Trust me, 1% is more than we would need. It would have to be a 0.1% law is basically all we would need. And the thing that's important about this is it's essentially a business model in the sense that it's market driven because it's a check off on your own tax return, and you get to choose which outlet you want to support. Now the rubber hits the road in deciding who gets to be eligible for a 1% checkoff. And I go into the history of how the IRS has handled this issue, 501c3s. And it definitely has had its problems, but it's no doubt it could do it. And if this, and it's grappled with all of the questions that we're worried about today, the InfoWars problem, for instance. So it's not, there are standards written into the IRS code. if there are problems with its execution, and my proposal would require attention to and bolstering of the Internal Revenue Service, that's okay. So that's where I come down. I'm basically just out of patience with all of the attempts to try and make commercial models work. They don't work. And we just, again, I love commercial. I'm from that world. I think it's great, but it's just, there's nothing on the horizon. As somebody has said, there's nothing to look forward to. We have to move forward with a public policy solution. I don't come to this conclusion lightly or happily, but here we are, and that's where I'm at.
Thanks a lot. I mean, I personally am not of the view that we need to be apologetic about making these kinds of suggestions. I think they're incredibly helpful. And I know this is exactly, Mark is nodding here because this is precisely the kind of thing you've been working on for years now. Mark, is this a moment? What are you seeing around the world, and what do you think is going to work? Because the conversation about capture leads to the solutions conversation, which is what we're all the most interested in anyway right now.
Yeah, thank you, Anya, and I want to just thank you for keeping this topic on the agenda, because you've done a tremendous amount to keep people working on this and thinking about it, because it is one of the biggest problems that we face in the media sector going forward, and the size of the problem is truly tremendous. It's on the scale of something like climate change, in the sense that our whole information system across the world has been moved into this model, and I think it affects a majority of media in the developing world in particular, but increasingly our own media. So we really need to think about this from a really broad, cross-cutting and far-reaching political challenge that we need to come together to create the policies and approaches that are necessary to address it. And it's made all the more difficult from my perspective that this issue is really taking hold in the rich world, because it makes it all the more difficult for the donors to help developing countries deal with this problem. And that has been a real issue in this area, because I think a lot of the policies and approaches that have been proffered by our media development, well-meaning media development activities in the developing world have actually made this problem worse and more difficult to deal with. And I think we need to think a lot about the kinds of models that we are proposing. I think there are three major malfunctions in our system. One has to do with the fact that we don't have a consensus on what needs to be done, and the political will among the democracies. And we are being met by a total consensus on the other side among the authoritarians, who are totally focused on media and know exactly what they want. And that's number one. And I think it's really critical for us to recognize that a lot of bad money is going into media. The second is that we have not come up with a consensus on remedies and on the ideas of what we need to do, and the alternative business models, or whatever kind of funding model we want to talk about. There's still a lot of discussion in our groups that we can't come to consensus. The third big thing is the total policy paralysis that Emily talked about, which has to do with an unwillingness to actually step into this system and regulate it and to do something about it. We've been led to believe that we can't regulate the media anymore, and we're not supposed. We've become so shy of dealing with critical issues like antitrust and even certain kinds of content regulation or taxation that needs to be brought into this conversation. So I think we really need to put those myths to sleep and start thinking about what kinds of solutions we might actually be able to do. And I think when we think of something so big and so far-reaching and so deep inside our political and economic systems, we can't fall into the trap to thinking that these answers are simple, because it will require us to take a new look at regulation. What kind of regulation is necessary? Not necessarily regulation of content, but especially media market regulation and antitrust regulation applied to the social media companies and search media, internet search media, and requiring a lot more transparency of ownership and disclosure of what's actually going on behind the scenes in the internet. And that takes me to internet governance, which is a key element in this. It means that defining an open internet, we have to maintain and fight for an open internet, but creating incentives and requirements for transparency and perhaps a taxing system or a funding system that makes it possible for possible and creates the incentives for a truth-telling resource on the internet, so that producers of content actually get paid for what they produce and find a way to integrate that into the internet governance system. And all of that requires political will, and that means bringing people together. And the last thing I want to say in my chapter, I talk a lot about this, is bringing the actors together, the Global South, into this conversation, because we absolutely will not find the answer to this problem by fixing it in our own societies. We have to do this at a global level, and it has to be a participatory, multi-stakeholder approach, because whatever we do needs to include people. You know, people in the Global South have PhDs in internet capture. I mean, it's been going on there, and global media capture, because it's been going on there for a lot longer, and people really do understand the dynamics and the way that it works. And anything that we do in Australia or in the United States or Western Europe, it may have knock-on effects, but we absolutely need to bring those voices into the conversation, because the people who are holding power in our societies do not see it as a priority for them. And we need to bring these alliances and knowledge from around the world into this conversation, including sympathetic governments who will be necessary in fixing this. So I'll stop there, because I'm not giving a simple solution, but I'm talking about how we do this and how we bring people together and build political consensus that we have to act.
Mark, I thought it was so interesting what you're saying about the Global South. When our last event, which Taylor and I did here with Sonia and others, we had 5 competition ministers and an official from the Canadian Heritage. And the South African competition minister, Bonakele, was very clear that African countries won't be able to act on their own. And they said that what they would really like to see, or what he would like to see, would be some sort of global body taking this on, you know, whether it's part of the UN or somewhere else. So I think what's happened is, because of this paralysis that you're talking about, it's sort of the EU that is really leading the way. And so a lot of us, I mean, the question, I guess, to some extent, is to what extent will the US just be following EU regulation, given that they've already, you know, the EU has come out with the Digital Services Draft Act, the UK has come out with you know, outlines for what their legislation is going to look like. And in the US, of course, we really haven't come up with a good plan to regulate tech, although we do have things like the Journalism Sustainability Act and the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act, which, as Taylor noted on one of our earlier discussions, is sort of pitting large outlets against small outlets, because there's now this tension, which again, we've seen in Germany, right, with Kraut Reporter actually suing the German government when they said they were going to give pots of money to traditional media outlets. Small ones sued, said you can't do that. As I understand, the German government has withdrawn that proposal completely. So I think that I think the good news is we've got loads of solutions out there, and the EU is starting to, you know, and the UK do seem like they're starting to move somewhat, although as we know, those laws that are aimed at reining in big tech aren't necessarily laws that are aimed at helping support local journalism. But I agree with you, it's not just paralysis, it's also infighting. which I think is very, very depressing. And I personally don't really have time for that anymore. There are so many places that have made parts of this work. We have good ideas what the solutions are. And I think, it's all very well for people to sit around carping, but I think it's sort of gone well beyond that. I don't know, Emily, or you were nodding and wanting to come in. I know Nikki had something to say, or Dean, whoever wants to speak, just speak. Dean, Emily, sorry.
Well, just on the solution set there, Anya, so one thing I think is, which is absolutely not alien to this group, because everybody here talks about this and writes about it. Whatever the solution is, it has to be multifaceted. And I think you hit on exactly the right thing when you were saying, it's not clear how much platform regulation would actually necessarily help local journalism. I do think that there are a couple of things that we've learned in the past 20 years, one of which is that, and Dean is working at the ICIJ, global networks are very, very powerful things, and we have to come up with network solutions. I think that there is also something on this which is, it's beholden, if you like, for those in journalism and the press. My friend Margaret Sullivan says, the media is kind of like everything now. The press is a very sort of specific part of it. So if we think about the press, when you're making new markets, which you are now really because of the amount of money which is moving in from philanthropy or not-for-profit or from platform funding. One of the things about that is you can actually make new markets where you create new incentives and where you create new standards, and you encourage the press to have and formulate and act within those standards. When you look at things like the ICIJ or OCCRP or whoever it is that creates, they create strong networks because they identify and recognize things which are high quality investigative journalism, and learn how to sort of, kind of leverage that and lift that. And I think, we're still in a transition period from where the press, certainly in this country, mostly in Europe, is still hyper competitive with each other and not really understanding that the bigger game is to redefine a bit of the field of journalism as well, outside commercial media, outside the sort of Fox propaganda machine, and say there is a particular type of activity that we perform, and we have to have a solution for that, and it has to work at local level, it has to work at regional level, and it has to work at national and international level. So there are positives, I think, here, and I think that we can do more than just be, if you like, sort of tossed on the kind of horns of fortune in terms of whatever Congress does or doesn't decide, or whatever the platforms, deign to give us. I think that we can be kind of really very positive about some of the things that we found from some of those new models that we've come up with. I thought I'd inject optimism.
And can I just add to that this also implies changing the way the donors who fund media development, the way they think about that, because I think we need to think more about forging these solutions through that funding, not necessarily, the last time we looked at this at SEMA in terms of media funding, a lot of media funding is still going to training journalists. And we really need to move beyond that kind of model of helping this sector advance across the world, and think more about the politics of our situation and how we create the space in our societies for independent media voices and build public support for that. Because what we are missing right now is that public support. So those people who are going against independent voices really don't have that much opposition to what they're doing. And we need to think a lot about how to organize that conversation. So this funding models that we come up with don't just need to fund the production of journalism, which I totally agree with, but also the process of forging the new policy environment and the new consensus at a global level.
Yeah, I wonder if I can just chime in. I think that we need to be really careful about where the funding interventions are coming from. And granted, I'm in the US context mainly, but I did research in my new book, I have a chapter on sort of kind of PAC philanthropy. and sort of the dangers of outsiders coming in to give funding. One of the things that I did was I basically tracked, like, where is investigative funding for journalism actually going in the United States? And it doesn't go to places that are under provision for news. It goes to places that are generally big and blue. And it goes to favored projects, and it is part and parcel of sort of a philanthropic donor class that, as you know, we can see with the Gates Foundation and the Soros Foundation, there's a lot of doubt. And there were two cases in particular I looked at that kind of have flip lessons, and I think speak to what we're saying in terms of new models. So Mississippi Today is basically paid for by Andrew Lack. And because it's funded essentially by one donor, it can challenge white supremacy in Mississippi in the way that no one else in that state can, right? And no other organization can. But it's always going to be sullied by the power makers as funded by outsiders, you know, with evil intentions. But there hasn't been a voice in Mississippi that strongly challenged white supremacy from a journalistic perspective, at least since the civil rights era, right? Like that strong of a voice. On the flip side, you can take a place like 100 Days in Appalachia, right, which is trying to reset the narrative of what Appalachia is supposed to be about. And there's a disconnect between the very distinct issues in Appalachia that most of us, unless we're, you know, camping or driving through, really don't encounter, right? But also when that money comes in to places that are very hostile to outside sort of left-leaning citified funding, right? Those folks got written up immediately on Breitbart as being like part of a George Soros like left-wing agenda. And so I guess that philanthropy in particular brings with it some real consequences when placed in a hyper-partisan sort of media environment. And so I think that's why some of the solutions around like the venture fund for journalism, American venture, what is it called? I'm forgetting. The thing that Elizabeth Green is
American Journalism Project?
Yeah, the American Journalism
Yeah.
Project. One of the things they're really looking at is what is demand in communities like, right? And what people and places and organizations in communities have demands. And they're being really imaginative about what that journalism has to look like, right? And I think that the conversation needs to be real about interventions and the challenges in our environment. So I'll go off my soapbox now.
Oops.
Nikki, that's super interesting. And I was just saying in the chat that Andrea Gabor wrote a chapter for our book that I'd always wanted someone to do, which was finally really taking a close look at a lot of these education reporting websites to see where did that money actually come from and what was that agenda. I think what I'm hearing is that, yes, philanthropy is needed, but is far from satisfactory, right? Which we've always known. And this is true, obviously, of, you know, many kinds. I mean, it would be the same as being too dependent on subscriber revenue, or too dependent on advertising revenue, or too dependent on government revenue. I mean, again, this is something that economists have described decades ago, that there's a spectrum. And if you have total government funding, you get sort of ideological journalism. And if you have total free market, you get that horrible race to the bottom. So I think one of the points that's coming through clearly here is that there has to be that sort of mixture. I wasn't sure, sorry, I'm being a terrible moderator. I thought I saw Mark nodding, but I didn't know if that meant you wanted to say something or you were just nodding in agreement.
I had something I wanted to shoehorn in. Basically, yeah, I was trying to say to everybody, I'd like to move beyond the philanthropic model altogether. And two things I thought Mark said really hit home for me. One is that authoritarians know very well the importance of media. Nobody knows that better than Viktor Orban. The first law he passed was the media law of 2010. It was 180 pages, ready the day he took office. Believe me, they know exactly how important media is. And you want to make sure that our Democratic supporting friends understand it too. The second thing Mark mentioned was antitrust, and I think that's a really critical issue, because when you think about it, news organizations are medium-sized businesses, And the internet is no country for medium-sized businesses because Google and Facebook essentially have vacuumed up via horizontal consolidation the digital advertising business, period. And there's no reason really organically that Google needs to own YouTube or Facebook needs to own WhatsApp and there's some stat that Google has made an acquisition like one a week for 15 years. I mean, our antitrust. Matt Stoller is really a smart guy. He wrote a book called Goliath about the history of antitrust in the U.S. And if you want your world kind of shifted a little bit, especially your view of U.S. history, you might want to pick that book up. It basically casts American politics or history in the last century as a struggle between capital and democracy. Pretty strong. But in any case, what I just wanted to sort of disagree with Mark. You need to, we need to move beyond philanthropy, and I, as much as I love my public solution, really there are trillions of dollars that should be unlocked that should be able to support medium-sized businesses. There's nothing it was not handed down from Mount Sinai that two companies should dominate the entire multi-trillion, whatever it is, market. And if you really want to go big, I think that's where you want to look. I think that was a great point you made.
Any panelists want to say anything, or anyone in the audience? We have a very illustrious, interesting audience, and it seems you brought your own fans with you.
I mean, one thing I would give a quick shout out to, which probably won't find favor with the panel either, is just the rather old-fashioned idea of developing a genuine public media system. And by genuine, I mean one which has some thought put into its design in terms of how it serves and is for and is conducted by the kinds of populations that Nikki's book talks about, which are, left out, and actually has those as incentives within it. And you always sort of come up in America, you always come up against the argument that, well, you don't want the government involved in this because look what Trump did with the VOA, et cetera, et cetera. Bad governments are always going to capture media, and as Dean quite rightly pointed out, Victor was ready to go on day one. Doesn't matter whether it's owned by the state or owned by private companies or whatever. Authoritarians will authoritarian. It will go in that direction. But if you're really interested in, pluralism and diversified funding models, the kind of projects that Europe undertook in the wake of the Second World War, which said, we need to think about how we are going to deliver some of this information and through these new systems. And, in the UK, it happens after the First World War with the BBC. We're at a moment when a lot of those systems don't really work anymore. But it doesn't mean that you should abandon the idea of reimagining this. There's a very kind of, it is, and I think, so back to Mark's point about, or Dean's point about climate and the scale of this. You do need big systemic answers to it, and some of those should be very ambitious and think about rebalancing that market. So I think that we haven't talked about public media or public-owned media or having a public media system, and it seems to me that you're always going to have the market in one way or another. You do need to counterbalance it, and I agree that philanthropy is not going to do the job, and we don't want Google and Facebook doing the job. At the moment, Google and Facebook are public media in the US, really. And that's a very long way, or that's the system of it. That's a very, very, very long way from being ideal. And it either needs to be regulated in that way, or we need to think about a counterbalancing structure.
And I would just add to that we have to think about a democratic system of governance for the media sector. That we need to understand that public participation and public engagement and the engagement of lawmakers and everyone is necessary in this space. That's, civil society plays a really critical role in defining what the issues are and bringing that to the fore. And we have to reopen that space to negotiation and to contestation, because we've let the you know, we've used the excuse of the First Amendment to allow the entire media industry, and I'm talking now about the broad media industry, the one that is, you know, $2.5 trillion a year. That media industry is now a major decision maker for our societies, and we have no voice in it. And we need to change that. And it means breaking things up and challenging the way the media is structured, but it could also mean some form of public media that would be necessary to counterbalance the, you know, the diversity of our political system that sometimes gets all out of whack. We need some way of governing a system that serves public interest.
So, I mean, I think that just to kind of remind folks a little bit that in a democracy, like there are going to be some really gross and disgusting people we don't agree with. And to some degree, like this belief in sort of a reformed civil society where people can come together, well, there's half of a country that doesn't want to do that anymore. And I think that part of acknowledging the reality of our media system is also acknowledging that. So I'm just kind of putting that out there as one thing. The second point is I've always sort of been against the idea of expanding public media in the context of the United States, but I do want to point out the sort of existence of already existing untapped resources in every community. And thanks to the FCC, you know, legislation dating back to the 70s, most communities have low-powered FM stations. Most communities have community television, right? New York City's is like well known, right? But even my little community here in Champaign, Urbana in Central Illinois, we've got a local access to local television, right? And so, how do we rethink the existing underutilized spaces that are already present and re-energize those? But also the flip side is, if we're going to talk about what media is very expansively, there are many institutions that now produce their own media that actually paves the way for journalists to do less, right? And I think to some degree, like that can be everything from thinking about how the local school board can now live stream, right? It's meetings, right? To thinking about how the like MTA reports its traffic mistakes, right? Or traffic delays. And so I just think we need to think expansively, but also take advantage of resources that are untapped, that are already there, that we can just kind of reimagine.
I'd agree with that. First of all, it reminds me a bit of ICIJ, which is when I give talks about ICIJ, the title would, if I ever did, the title would be "Making the Best of a Bad Situation," because what it does is it, you know, the internet taketh away, but it also giveth, you know, and I couldn't work remotely without email and we have 50 people or so, and a third of them develop tech platforms in Paris, and we work securely around the world on our own Facebook, and we have our own data search secure platform that the Russian government has been trying to hack since Panama Papers, and you know, it's super secure. So there are ways, and we are basically a way to leverage weakened news organizations to become more powerful. So Le Monde is our partner, The Guardian is our partner, and Miami Herald's our partner. All of them are much weaker than they used to be, but together, if we cooperate and don't argue and don't jump the gun and you know and work together and be super disciplined and super discreet, and we have been, you know, you can make a profound impact. So I agree with that. So there's a lot of potential kind of lying around that could be exploited while we pursue those antitrust suits against Google and Facebook.
I agree, but I have to say I really agree also with Emily. And this reminds me in the 1980s when the British government was privatizing British gas. And do you remember the posters? The whole thing was Sid. Sid needed to buy bits of British gas, buy shares. And do you remember the poster from the Labour Party? Tell Sid he already owns British gas. And I think there's something to be said for scale, right? Yes, it's great to have everybody set up small outlets all over the place. God knows I wrote, I edited 2 books on global muckraking, funded, helped make decisions about, funding that stuff for years. I think it's wonderful, but I also think there's something to be said for scale. And the fact is the US doesn't necessarily have the mechanisms that other places do, but I'm also not sure that we can give up on that option. I mean, you've all heard me talking about my PhD dissertation, where after going through so many options of what to do about mis and disinformation, I came to the conclusion that if we want scale, then we have to talk about regulation. Right? Because all the well-meaning, and I've covered school boards in small towns, like that stuff can also get captured locally as well. So I think we're going to have both, really, very much so. The local initiatives and the local funding, but also at large solutions at scale. I think that we have 3 minutes left, and I think Taylor wanted to come in. So please, Taylor, thank you so much for all of this. Please come in.
And just, we're glad to have you on team regulation, even if it took you a whole dissertation to get there. But Nikki started this with a comment that some of the people here make a choice to not take money from platforms. And my sense is that's getting more and more difficult, and it's a lonelier and lonelier island. And it's not just research institutions, it's journalistic ones as well. I mean, we're heading into a place in Canada, partly because of what happened in Australia, where virtually every journalistic organization in the country is taking money negotiated on an ad hoc basis for programming that is in the interests of the platforms. And it is getting harder and harder to even avoid that programming if you work in this space. I consistently have to deny requests to do events because they're funded in some way by a platform. So because I'm just wondering to what degree a media capture debate, which often feels binary, like either you're captured or you're not, can address with that much more pernicious and on the surface, though, innocuous kind of capture, which is just spreading money thinly to everybody so you're involved in every conversation. And if that's where we're headed, it's worrying to me. I guess that's not a question, more a comment, but
a good comment. I was at a media festival in Perugia a few years ago, and I can't remember, and it's a great conference, don't get me wrong, but there was some storm going on about Facebook, and it was awfully quiet there. There was like 600 panels, and the silence was kind of deafening. I can't remember exactly what it was, but no doubt you're right. And again, I think as Emily was saying, we gotta think big here and not accept the status quo as some kind of permanent or acceptable situation from a public policy standpoint.
And the amount of money that the platforms are giving is minuscule compared to the profits of the organizations that have taken, close to 100% of digital advertising. I mean, that whole shift is so incredibly profitable to them. And, when they hand out $10 million, everybody says, oh my God, Facebook is giving $10 million. It's peanuts. So, I mean, we have to be really, really ready to say, we don't need that from you. What we need from you is that we change your behavior in a major fundamental way and your business model in a fundamental way that serves society and not your bottom line. Yeah. That's what we have to do. That's what we did in the 1930s in the creation of the institutions that served this country pretty well, and for 50 years. And we've got other people to think about in the world besides our own media market, which is incredibly important as well. And so I really do think we need to be a lot more aggressive about thinking what we can do, but we have to get together in order to do it.
Great. So I think that's a super rousing note to close out on. I love that after all of this lively debate, the thing we all agree on is we don't like capture and we want big tech to pay more money. I was having a drink this week with my dad's college buddy who's a lawyer, and he was telling about the arguments in the 1960s about antitrust. So, this is all the stuff that Tim Wu was writing about, right? And he personally had those arguments over neo-Brandeisian economics and regulation, and the argument that it's not all just about consumer welfare, right? There are other things that matter when you approve mergers. So Andrea Pratt, who was one of the economists who first started writing about media capture, makes that argument, right? That competition regulations need to be updated because it's not just about prices or simple consumer welfare. But so on one hand, I'm glad we're having this conversation. On the other hand, I'm sort of depressed that this is a conversation that really has just been going on for decades. So I know everyone's zoomed out and it's a hectic time of year because we've got all our pandemic Zooms and habits, and now we have our real life Zooms habits and seeing people in person. So I feel like everyone's twice as busy as they were a year ago. So I'll just say huge thanks to this illustrious audience. Thank you so much to Taylor and to Sonia and to Phaedra for hosting this event. And of course to the panelists for contributing the chapters. Again, hopefully we'll be able to celebrate some of this in person before too long. So thanks everybody for coming. I really, really appreciate it.